What if I told you that in 2025, in the span of just 229 days, nearly 78,000 Christians have already been murdered in Nigeria and hundreds of churches razed, and almost no major media is sounding the alarm? You might say the number is impossible, exaggerated, or unverified. But the deeper you dig, the more you find chilling patterns, suppressed testimonies, and blatant denials designed to mask what's happening. Behind a veil of silence, the Christian population in Nigeria is under siege. Brutal daily slaughter. Across Nigeria's north, middle belt, and even spilling southwards, attacks by jihadist militants, Boko Haram, ISWAP, Islamic State West Africa Province, Fulani militias, and newer groups like Lakurawa have become more frequent and more deadly. Churches are bombed, worshippers ambushed, whole villages razed. A silent genocide claim. Multiple sources now speak of a silent genocide, a war on Christians that the world refuses to see. According to concerned Christian watch groups, more than 52,000 Christians have been killed in Nigeria since 2009. Churches up in flames. Estimates suggest that more than 19,000 churches have been destroyed, looted, or abandoned across Nigeria. Entire Christian communities have been displaced. In Yelwata, between June 13th and 14th, 2025, gunmen reportedly killed 100 to 200 Christian villagers, many of whom were internally displaced persons taking refuge at a local Catholic mission. In Kwalajia, Sokoto State, militants allegedly stormed the village during afternoon prayers, killing 15 to 17 and burning homes. More recently, Boko Haram reportedly killed 4 Christians and destroyed a church in a northern community. Kidnapping of clergy, forced conversions, sexual violence. Christian pastors, priests, and lay believers are routinely abducted, sometimes for ransom, other times simply for their faith. Women are at risk of sexual violence, forced marriages, or being trafficked. Denial, propaganda. The federal government often rejects charges of religious targeting, framing violence as herder-farmer conflicts, resource struggles, or general banditry, narratives that dilute the religious dimension. Despite mounting death tolls, many international media outlets either ignore the crisis or treat it as a marginal local issue. Even when highlighted, the scale is often downplayed. If the real death toll truly nears 78,000 in under 8 months, how many more would fall silent before the year closes? If churches can be burned by night and no report emerges by dawn, how many communities vanish without a trace? But even as the embers of these raids still smolder, a murmur is rising, a chorus of unlikely allies piercing the veil of denial, their voices amplified by the raw fury of social media and the unyielding spotlights of Capitol Hill. What if I told you that in the sweltering heat of October 2025, figures as disparate as a firebrand Texas senator and a sharp-tongued atheist comedian are converging on the same grim truth? Nigeria's Christians are not just dying, they are being systematically erased. Ted Cruz, that unflinching hawk of the Republican right, didn't mince words this week, slamming the floor of the U.S. Senate with a bill, the Nigeria Religious Freedom Accountability Act of 2025, that demands sanctions on Nigerian officials complicit in the bloodletting, branding it mass murder that's claimed over 50,000 Christian lives since 2009 alone. He's not alone. West Virginia Congressman Riley Moore fired off a letter to Secretary of State Marco Rubio just days ago, urging the U.S. to slap Nigeria with country of particular concern status, a diplomatic scarlet letter that could freeze aid and trade, all because, as Moore put it, the government's willful blindness to jihadist atrocities has turned the Middle Belt into a charnel house, FA5F. And then there's Bill Maher, the HBO provocateur who spent decades skewering religion, who dropped a bombshell monologue on Real Time last Friday. If this isn't genocide, what the hell is? Thousands hacked to death, churches torched like they're kindling, and the Nigerian government? They're gaslighting us harder than a bad breakup. His words ricocheted across X, where hashtag Christian Genocide Nigeria trended for 48 hours straight, fueled by viral clips from survivors and grainy drone footage of Fulani riders vanishing into the dawn after a hit-and-run slaughter in Plateau State. Even the Christian Association of Nigeria, CAN, that beleaguered umbrella of denominations long accused of pulling punches, finally cracked open the floodgates on October 8th with a press statement that read like a Jeremiad. The cries for justice from our beleaguered communities are often ignored, drowned out by the din of denial. They didn't shy from the numbers. Over 7,000 believers fell in 2025's first 8 months. Or the pattern. Targeted attacks on Christian farming villages, with militants sparing Muslim neighbors while chanting takbirs over the pyres. Open Doors, that watchdog of the persecuted, echoed the alarm in their latest dispatch, ranking Nigeria 6th on the 2025 Global Terrorism Index and warning that Fulani militias, swollen with ISWAP recruits, are escalating jihadist violence at a clip that could double the death toll by year's end. From the Vatican to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, prayers are turning to pleas. Reflect on Nigeria's half-Christian, half-Muslim divide. They urged during Religious Freedom Week, where the faithful flee not just for their lives, but for their souls. And on X, the digital agora, pastors like Reverend Vitus OSS are live-streaming from bloodied pews, tallying 19,100 churches obliterated since 2009, while activists tag Elon Musk and Donald Trump in threads that blister with urgency. 51 gunned down in Plateau just last weekend. When does the world wake up? Yet, as these voices swell into a roar, Abuja's corridors of power echo with a chilling refrain. Lies, all lies. The Nigerian federal government, that labyrinth of suits and stonewalling, has doubled down with the ferocity of a cornered regime. Information Minister Sunday Dare, perched in a Paris studio for a France 24 showdown, dismissed Cruz's crusade as careless rhetoric that fuels misunderstanding, insisting the carnage is terrorism targeting everyone, not a Christian genocide. Vice President Kashim Shettima, himself a Fulani Muslim, took to the UN podium last month not to mourn the mass graves, but to pivot to Palestinian plight, leaving confuming in a leaked memo, our own genocide, invisible to the very leaders sworn to protect us. And in a leaked State House briefing, officials branded international reports propaganda from evangelical vultures, pointing to complex ethnic clashes over grazing lands as the real culprit. Never mind the eyewitness videos of militants rifling through Bibles before the blades fall, or the fact that 90% of the victims in Benway's June bloodbath were baptized believers. Genocide Watch, that grim oracle of mass atrocities, called it out bluntly in their July update. Overwhelming evidence of genocidal acts, yet the government remains in denial, avoiding the legal and moral reckoning. Critics whisper of deeper rot. Billions in oil revenue funneled to northern patronage networks that quietly arm the herders, while southern Christian governors are starved of federal troops. It's not incompetence, one anonymous aide told Al Jazeera off-record. It's calculus. But peel back the official spin, and the slaughter marches on. A relentless drumbeat that mocks the denials with fresh graves every dawn. Just 72 hours ago, in the mist-shrouded hills of Guma, Benue State, ground zero for Fulani fury, militants on dirt bikes swept through 3 villages, torching 47 homes and a makeshift chapel before vanishing with 14 girls in tow. Their parents' wails captured in a 30-second clip that's already been scrubbed from Nigerian servers but lives eternal on X. Over in Plateau, where the earth still weeps from June's Yelwada massacre, 270 worshippers hacked apart mid-prayer, their blood pooling under a blood moon. Fresh reports tallied 51 more on October 10th, including a pastor gunned down at his own child's baptism. Taraba's borderlands fared no better. A female Christian kidnapper bus turned out to be a red herring, a government-planted story to deflect from the real abductions. Hundreds funneled into bush brothels where conversion is the only currency for release. Boko Haram splinter, ISWAP, claimed a dawn raid in Borno on October 9th, executing 8 farmers for infidel hymns and dynamiting their irrigation pumps. A scorched earth prelude to famine. These aren't anomalies. They're the new normal, with Open Doors logging 218 dead and 6,000 displaced in a single Benue spasm back in June, pushing the year's refugee tally past 3 million. Christians comprising 80%, per UN undercounts that even humanitarian wonks call tragically lowball. Delve into the displacement, and the true obscenity unfurls. Not just numbers, but the slow suffocation of souls. Picture the IDP camps outside Makurdi, Benwe's battered heart, where 52,000 souls, mostly Tiv and Idoma Christians, huddle under UNHCR tarps that flap like tattered prayer flags in the relentless rain. Elias's family from earlier, Multiply them by thousands. Fathers like him, once stewards of yam pyramids that fed Lagos markets, now scavenging cassava peels from aid drops, their hands idle, their pride pulverized. Children, wide-eyed with the trauma of watching machetes claim uncles, drop out of school at rates topping 70%, funneled into hawking or worse, forced labor in the very fields their kin once owned, now grazed by the herdsman's cattle under armed guard. Mothers bear the brunt. Widowed by dawn raids, they trek miles to fetch water laced with cholera, their wombs emptied by miscarriages from malnutrition or the terror of midnight violations. In one camp ledger from the International Society for Civil Liberties, 1,200 women reported bush marriages to militants, euphemism for serial rape. Since January, birthing jihad babies, they can neither abort nor claim, ghosts in a system that brands them apostates if they whisper of Christ. Economies shatter like clay pots under boot. Bainway's rice bowl, once exporting $200 million annually, lies fallow, ceded to nomadic herds that trample seedlings and poison wells with offal. Families splinter. Sons conscripted into vigilante emoticon militias, daughters trafficked south to Lagos brothels, elders left to rot in abandoned villages where hyenas prowl the pews. And the mental toll? Suicide clusters in the camps, pastors presiding over funerals of the living, for those whose faith frays under the weight. God, why us? Scrawled in charcoal on tent walls, a litany unanswered by Abuja's platitudes. Whispers from the shadows suggest the enablers are multiplying. Border posts in Cameroon and Chad, riddled with graft, funnel RPGs and AKs to Fulani warlords who double as government informants. In Kaduna, imams with state salaries preach land jihad, from minbars untouched by the flames that lick Christian spires nearby. Even Kant's clarification, admitting the rising attacks, while tiptoeing around genocide, drew fire from survivors on X. Our own leaders, selling us out for peace talks that never come. As U.S. pressure mounts, crews vowing accountability that could blacklist Nigerian envoys, Tuberville thundering on Fox about 62,000 murdered by extremists. Abuja's retorts grow shrill, summoning diplomats to debunk falsehoods, while troops in Jos stand down during the next full moon. But in the camps, as another convoy of gunmen revs toward the horizon, one question hangs heavier than the harmattan dust. How many more must bleed before the denials crack, and the world finally intervenes? What if I told you that the questions nobody in power will answer out loud are the only ones that matter, and that those questions point straight at the heart of the crisis? Are elements inside the Nigerian state looking the other way, or worse, quietly abetting? While Christian towns are slaughtered, churches burned, and families vanish, why does Abuja insist the story is false when governors, priests, survivors, and foreign lawmakers say otherwise? What are the police and the armed forces not telling us about who plans and executes these raids, who benefits, and why so many bodies go uncounted? Listen to the outline of what's being said and what's being denied. Accusations, whispers, and public pressure. A growing number of international politicians, faith groups, and advocacy organizations now argue the violence has a targeted religious dimension. Lawmakers in the United States and NGO investigators have framed the spike in attacks against Christian communities as not only criminal but systematic, urging diplomatic pressure and even formal designations. One U.S. congressman's recent letter laid out figures and urged the State Department to act. At the same time, respected human rights organizations and investigative outlets have documented horrific, mass casualty events. Villages wiped out in midnight raids, survivors burned out of their homes, children and elderly left behind, and cataloged a pattern of mass displacement and destroyed houses of worship. These reports show a severity beyond ordinary banditry. Whole neighborhoods emptied, repeated targeting of churches, and civilians killed during worship. The official answer: denial and reframing. But the Nigerian federal government has pushed back hard. Senior officials and presidential aides insist the violence is a complex mix of criminality, herder-farmer disputes, separatist agitation, and Islamist insurgency, not a state-sanctioned or religion-targeted campaign. Government spokespeople and some local political leaders say calling it a genocide is inflammatory and inaccurate, and they warn that simplistic religious labels could inflame the country further. That rebuttal has been published and amplified by government-aligned voices. So we have two parallel realities: a chorus of alarm from survivors, clergy, NGOs, and foreign lawmakers, and an official chorus insisting the narrative is false, dangerous, or exaggerated. Why would the government deny it? There are several brutal, practical reasons why a federal government might deny or downplay what's happening: the political survival and legitimacy. Admitting systematic targeting of Christians would force the state to explain massive security failures, which could delegitimize the government domestically and invite sanctions internationally. Denial protects the official narrative that the state remains in control. Avoiding international consequences. An official recognition of targeted religious persecution could trigger diplomatic punishments, trade restrictions, or legal obligations, investigations, humanitarian interventions. Denial reduces that risk. Preventing sectarian escalation. Authorities often argue blunt public labeling could inflame reprisals and wider communal warfare. Whether that argument is honest or convenient cover is the question survivors ask. The institutional corruption and infiltration. When security institutions are underfunded, politicized, or infiltrated by local power brokers, some actors within the system may tacitly collude with militia interests through bribery, patronage, or shared local loyalties. Reports of selective responses and failure to pursue attackers feed these suspicions. Amnesty and other monitors have repeatedly documented not only gaps in protection but also instances where security operations violated rights, undermining trust. What the police and armed forces aren't telling us, and why that silence matters. Survivors, local clergy, and watchdogs list the same worrying omissions: underreporting of casualties and displaced people. Official casualty tallies and the numbers released by some states often lag far behind NGO counts or eyewitness reports. That gap matters. Undercounting reduces urgency and shrinks the humanitarian response. A lack of credible investigations. Families who hand over names and footage say inquiries stall. Arrests either are not made or do not lead to prosecutions. When communities publicly name suspects, prosecutions are rare, which fuels the belief that attackers enjoy impunity. Human rights reporting highlights weak accountability, restricted access, and information control. Journalists and investigators are sometimes blocked from attack sites, or footage is taken down. Social media narratives are contested and labeled propaganda. Without independent verification, atrocities can be downplayed or dismissed. Failure to protect vulnerable sites. Churches, markets, and IDP camps, places that should be priorities for protection, are repeatedly left exposed. Survivors ask how armed groups can operate for hours in some areas without credible security response. Amnesty and other bodies document such security vacuums. Is Nigeria becoming an Islamist state? That is the hardest, most explosive question, and the one that risks flattening a tangled reality. Nigeria is not officially an Islamist state. It is a secular federation with a constitution guaranteeing freedom of religion. Yet parts of the country, especially in the far north, have long been contested by Islamist insurgents, Boko Haram and ISWAP, who explicitly pursue extremist religious goals. Other attacks, especially in the Middle Belt, are tied to communal, economic, and political drivers, even if they take on religious coloration. The question some people now ask is whether the combination of insurgency, communal polarization, and state weakness is effectively creating territories where extremist Islamic actors exercise control and impose harsh, sectarian rules. That fear is not abstract. When militants control land and governance, the experience for minorities in those places can resemble living under a de facto theocracy. The human voice that breaks through the noise. Listen to the survivors. Pastors who watched congregations burned while calling for help. Mothers carrying infants through bush paths into IDP camps. Local registries of the dead compiled by priests because no credible state count exists. Their testimony is raw, bitter, and consistent. People who once felt safe in their villages now live in tents, or in the shadow of a neighboring town where soldiers rarely come. And yet, the official records say something different. A mismatch that is destroying faith in both church and state.